Today, we'll look back at past lawsuits involving Nintendo and consider the current litigation issue with Palworld. Let's start with a brief overview of recent events. Nintendo has sued Palworld for patent infringement. Meanwhile, Palworld has partnered with Sony for PlayStation 5 expansion. They even had a booth at Tokyo Game Show with numerous cosplayers. But wouldn't it be unwise to anger Nintendo? Japanese patent law only applies within Japan. It's fine overseas. Really? Alright, let's sell it abroad then. While it's unclear if such an exchange occurred between Palworld and Sony, Palworld announced global expansion at Tokyo Game Show. Some users were puzzled by the announcement of worldwide release, excluding Japan where their headquarters are located. Isn't this a bit too blatant from Palworld and Sony? If they don't think they're in the wrong, shouldn't they release it in Japan too? I dislike this kind of disrespectful attitude. While Japanese users are confused, Palworld enjoys overwhelming support from overseas users. Nintendo's next move is of great interest. Speaking of overseas users, the majority of Palworld's user base is concentrated in the United States and China. It's fair to say that support mainly comes from these two countries. Nintendo's legal department has handled numerous game lawsuits, winning a high percentage of cases. They've not only won domestic trials but also many foreign ones, which undoubtedly contributes to the impression that Nintendo's legal team is unbeatable. Even crying children fall silent before Nintendo's legal department. Typically tolerant, but terrifying when angered. Objection. Let's look at some of Nintendo's most notable legal cases. The Donkey Kong lawsuit. Universal City Studios, an American film company, sued Nintendo, claiming that Nintendo's game Donkey Kong infringed on Universal's rights. Nintendo was the defendant but won this case. In the trial, Nintendo proved Universal's King Kong copyright had expired and no rights existed. Conversely, Universal's King Kong was infringing on Nintendo's Donkey Kong rights. As a result, Universal was found guilty of defamation and had to pay substantial damages to Nintendo. Being sued but counter-suing and winning. This case arguably marks the beginning of Nintendo's legal department's legendary status. Interestingly, one of Nintendo's lawyers was named John Kirby, who later became the namesake for the game character Kirby. The Tear Ring Saga lawsuit. Nintendo sued Enterbrain and developer Tiernanog, claiming that Enterbrain's game Tear Ring Saga, Utena Heroes Saga closely resembled Nintendo's Fire Emblem series, violating copyright law and unfair competition prevention law. The case was eventually settled with Enterbrain paying Nintendo for legal costs and other expenses. Nintendo's claims included the following. Striking similarity to Fire Emblem. The game was initially named Emblem Saga, and many connections to Fire Emblem were evident. This game was actually created by staff who had left the company that developed Fire Emblem. So it seems somewhat unavoidable that the game content and systems would be similar. However, in interviews, these staff members said things like, "We want to include Fire Emblem characters too. To be honest, this is a sequel to Fire Emblem." These statements ultimately led to their loss in court. Identical weapon names and properties. The weapons from Fire Emblem appear in the game with the exact same properties. In other words, they're identical. Even the rapier being the protagonist's exclusive weapon is the same. Some people say, they could have changed it a bit more. Character designs resembling Fire Emblem. The character designs were so similar that someone unfamiliar with the games might mistake it for a sequel or part of the same series. This is similar to what's happening with Palworld. It's not an exact copy, but to the untrained eye, it looks almost identical. This Tear Ring Saga case actually shares similarities with the current Palworld controversy, releasing on non-Nintendo hardware. Just like Palworld releasing on PlayStation 5, Tear Ring Saga was also sold on PlayStation. Promotional materials evoking comparisons to Nintendo's IP. The footage and materials used for advertising consistently evoked associations with Fire Emblem, ignoring Nintendo's warnings. Nintendo didn't immediately jump to litigation. They continued to issue warnings, but Tear Ring Saga, perhaps thinking there were no legal issues, ignored them. Initially, Nintendo's claims of copyright infringement were largely dismissed in court. Nintendo persisted and changed their strategy, arguing the following. The developers gave interviews implying Tear Ring Saga was a Fire Emblem sequel. This claim led to Tear Ring Saga's defeat. Palworld's creators have similarly made public statements about copying various games and consulted lawyers about potential similarity to Pokémon. First, we decide on a game to use as a reference. At first, we try to imitate it faithfully. It's a matter of gameplay, and we see what parts we can and can't imitate, so we just imitate what we can and thoroughly discuss what we can't. But that's okay. I think that's the development of culture and the history of content itself. Whether there is illegality or not can be contested by the parties in court. However, if we look back on history calmly, the game industry is also a parade of rip-offs, and when the number of rip-off games exceeds a certain threshold, it becomes a genre, and the atmosphere becomes one in which rip-offs are tolerated. More than 90% of the UI of Super Nintendo RPGs is a rip-off of Dragon Quest, or Final Fantasy, and almost 100% of fighting games have the same UI. Viewing this situation objectively, Nintendo seems to be saying, don't make games with art styles similar to ours, we can't win on copyright alone, so we'll use other tactics. Meanwhile, Pocket Pair appears to be thinking, we're fine even if sued for copyright infringement. We're copying like crazy, we've been sued. But the law only applies in Japan. Let's sell overseas. However, Nintendo has recently won against defiant companies. Will history repeat itself? Palworld maintains its stance even in the face of Nintendo's lawsuit. Let's keep an eye on future developments. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.